vCenter is an amazing way to centrally administer our ESXi host, but one of the challenges is we've got to get that puppy deployed in our infrastructure before we can start using it. So in this nugget, we'll walk through the steps and do the hands-on lab of installing vCenter in our vSphere environment. Can you imagine if we had like 15 or 16 ESXi hosts and we had to manage them all independently with a tool like the VMware host client, where we connect over to ESXi1, take a look at it, configure it, and then connect over to ESXi2? It's not that fun or reasonable to try to manage a whole bunch of ESXi hosts on a one-by-one basis. And that's why we have the tool of vCenter to go ahead and do centralized administration of our entire vSphere environment. With the goal being, once we deploy vCenter, we can then go ahead and connect to that vCenter with the vSphere web client. And then through vCenter, we can configure, manage, and monitor all of our ESXi hosts, as well as the virtual machines that are running on those ESXi hosts. And we have a few options in deploying the vCenter. Number one, we can deploy it on a Windows platform. So if you're a Windows shop and you've got licenses for Windows Server, that's great. Or if you want to deploy the vCenter as an appliance that's pre-built, pre-packaged from VMware, we can deploy vCenter as the vCenter Server Appliance. And the acronym for that is vCSA. And in the old days, the vCSA was limited in its capacity and how much it could handle. But nowadays, the current version of the vCSA, it's on par with what we could get if we deployed vCenter on a Windows server. And most companies are opting to use the vCenter Server Appliance just because it's so darn convenient. It's also the direction that VMware would like us to go. So for the lab, we're going to use the vCenter Server Appliance. So the vCenter Server Appliance is based on Linux. They've got a tuned and tweaked version of Linux that they call Photon. And one of the cool things about vCenter is that as we make changes to the various ESXi hosts, vCenter has a database keeping track of all that information. So not only is the configuration pushed and kept on the ESXi hosts, but there's also a database on the vCenter that's going to also reflect how those hosts are configured. So there's a database that comes with it. And also with the vCenter Server Appliance, there's two major packages that are part of it. One of those major packages as part of the appliance is the Platform Services Controller, and the other major part is the actual vCenter server itself. And one of the cool things is we can decide when we deploy this if we want these two elements running on the same appliance or the same system. So for example, if we deploy the vCSA and we have the Platform Services Controller, which I'll go ahead and acronym here as PSC, and the vCenter server running on that same appliance, they refer to this as embedded, meaning the Platform Services Controller is embedded with the server on the same vCenter server appliance. And the question may come up, well, Keith, if it's called embedded when the Platform Services Controller and the vCenter server element are both on the same appliance, what's the other option? And the other option is they can be apart. And it would look something like this. We'd have a vCenter server appliance, and on that appliance, we could have the Platform Services Controller, and then a second vCenter server appliance. And on that one, we could actually have the server. And those would be associated with each other. And in a larger environment, if we wanted to have multiple servers, we could have another vCenter server appliance with another server that are all part of the same single sign-on domain in vSphere. And this vCenter server appliance with this server could also be associated with the Platform Services Controller. Or if your environment is big enough, you could have yet another one as well. So we could have another server in its own vCenter server appliance that's also associated with that Platform Services Controller. Now, in a large environment, as we look at this, one of the questions that might come up is, what if there's a failure of the Platform Services Controller? Then all of our servers are going to be out of luck. So with fault tolerance, we could do something like this. We could have two PSCs in two different appliances, and we could configure them in an active passive role. So one's active, one's passive, and then put a load balancer on the network. For example, an F5 load balancer or the vendor of your choice, who's doing health and status monitoring of those devices. And with the redundancy, they would be keeping track of each other as well. And then we could have our multiple vCenter server appliances, these three right here, all running the server, that are going through the load balancer to get to the Platform Services Controller. So if this Platform Services Controller right here, which is active, fails, the load balancer can switch over to the second PSC, who would then go active, and the vCenter servers would still have their controller to interact with. So the simplest method of implementing the vCSA, the vCenter server appliance, in a small environment is simply to do it embedded, meaning that the platform services controller and the vCenter server are embedded on the same vCenter server appliance. And that's what we're going to do in the lab. And the other question that we need to ask as we deploy a vCenter server appliance in our environment is, where should this live? Now, this is going to be deployed as a virtual machine. So we're going to need some type of a hypervisor somewhere to go ahead and support and run this virtual machine. And the great news is we've got 3 hypervisors. We've got ESXi 1, 2, and 3 all ready to go. So what I propose that you and I do in this lab is let's go ahead and deploy the vCenter server appliance, and let's deploy it as a VM right here on ESXi1. And then we'll configure ESXi1 so that every time it boots, it'll go ahead and automatically start that VM so that you and I, here at our management workstation, we can connect over to that vCSA. And to do that, we're going to use the vSphere web client. We'll log on, and then from there, we can centrally manage all of our ESXi hosts. And during the deployment, there's actually 2 main stages that we're going to go through. Number 1, we're going to deploy the vCSA, the actual VM itself. And then secondly, we're going to go ahead and configure it. So I'll walk you through that step by step, and you can do the hands-on practice to reinforce that knowledge in the lab. So the place we're going to start is from this workstation in our lab environment. I've got a CD attached, or DVD rather, attached. And that DVD is the ISO with vCenter. So we're going to go into that DVD, launch the install. As part of the install, we'll point to the ESXi host where we want to deploy the virtual machine. And as part of that, we're going to be asked to authenticate. So as a reminder, the user on the ESXi host is root, and the lab password is what we're using for the password for root, so that we can go ahead and deploy the vCenter server appliance as a VM on this ESXi host. So we're going to start off on DCNUG, which is acting as our Windows management computer. And here on DCNUG, let's go ahead and open up File Explorer to go to the DVD drive. So let's click on the File Explorer icon here in the taskbar. And let's click on this PC. And then we'll go ahead and double click on the DVD drive, which is drive D. So we're looking at the contents for the vCSA server appliance DVD. So on this disk, if we go into the vCSA-UI installer, which we'll do by double clicking on the vCSA-UI installer, and in that folder, there's a subfolder called Win32. So we'll double click on Win32 to go into that folder. And here we have an application called Installer, which we'll go ahead and double click on to start the install of the vCenter server appliance. So we'll double click on Installer, and I'll go ahead and bring that full screen. And we have several options, and because this is our fresh install, we're going to choose the option, the top one here, called Install. And this install, as we follow it, it's going to give us the choice about which type of deployment do we want. Do we want embedded, where the platform services controller and vCenter server on the same appliance, which is embedded, or do we want to have a distributed or external deployment where the platform services controller is on its own VM and the vCenter server is on a separate VM? So external or distributed, we're talking about the platform services controller not being on the same VM as the vCenter server itself. So we'll click on Install to start the process. And there's 2 stages. Stage 1 is deploying the virtual machine, and Stage 2 is configuring the appliance. So we'll go ahead and click on Next to continue. We'll read the end user license agreement, click the checkbox to say we accept it, and click on Next to continue. Here it's giving us the choice of the deployment. The first option here is the embedded option with the platform services controller embedded on the same VM, the same appliance as the vCenter server, or if we want to go ahead and separate those and have an external deployment, we could go ahead and choose a radio button down here. And for those companies that want to do an external or distributed deployment, they need to make sure they have a platform services controller deployed first, and then go back and secondly deploy the vCenter server after the platform services controller VM is already in place. So for our lab, we'll leave the top radio button selected, and we'll click on Next. Next, it's asking us, hey, I need to know which ESXi host is going to be the host supporting this VM, this vCenter server appliance. So we'll put the fully qualified domain name here of ESXi1, which corresponds to 192.168.1.101. And in a prior nugget, we already verified that DNS resolution is working correctly. We'll use the default port for HTTPS, which is 443. And now it's asking us for the username and password on the ESXi host, which is going to allow us to deploy the vCenter server appliance on the host. So we'll go ahead and type in root as the username on ESXi1, and then we'll put our lab password right here in the password field. And with that in place, we'll click on Next to continue. It's giving us a warning about the self-signed certificate on ESXi1. And if we wanted to verify that we were literally talking to the correct host, we could go back over to the DCUI, the Direct Console User Interface on ESXi1, and from the menu system, we could actually look at the SHA-1 thumbprint for the SSL certificate, just to make sure that it matches and we're connected to the host that we think we are. So we'll go ahead and click Yes to continue. And now it's asking us for information regarding the vCenter server appliance itself. Now, there's a couple of usernames we're going to set up. One is going to be the root user and its password. That's if we ever need to go deep in the bowels of that system, the vCenter server appliance. From a root perspective, we need to know what the password is, so we're setting it here. In a subsequent step, we'll also set up a password for administrator. That's for the GUI portion, if you will, for our day-to-day management of vSphere using vCenter. So here for the root password, we're going to use the lab password once again, and then we'll click in the confirm root password and we'll put it in again. So with the root password supplied and confirmed for the vCenter server appliance, we'll go ahead and click on next to continue. Next, it's asking us about the deployment size, and this matters because if we're managing, for example, 2,000 ESXi hosts and 35,000 VMs that are running on those hosts, we're going to need a lot of resources to keep track of all that, including database size and so forth. However, if we're deploying, for example, 5 or 6 ESXi hosts, and we're going to have 50 or 60 VMs running across those ESXi hosts, we don't need to type a whole bunch of resources for the vCenter server appliance if it's not going to need them. And that's why it's asking us here about the deployment size. So for our lab, we'll say tiny, and we'll accept the default storage size based on tiny, and we'll click on next to continue. Next, the install process has looked at the ESXi host called ESXi1 and looked at the data stores that are there and identified, hey, you've got a data store, a place to store data, including files for a virtual machine, and the data store that we have is called ESXi-1_datastore, and it shows 71.55 gigabytes free. So what we're going to do when we deploy this, we are going to choose this option to enable thin disk mode. And what that allows us to do is not dedicate all the space for a virtual machine until it actually needs it. So if a virtual machine says, I need 200 gigabytes, but I'm only using 40, with thin disk mode, we'll only really consume 40 gigabytes on the storage and not the full amount. And then as the VM needs more storage and is really using that space, the hypervisor will stay in step with that and only really tie up as much storage space as the VM is literally using at that moment. So for the lab, we're going to go ahead and click the checkbox next to enable thin disk mode. And if you want to click on the little eye symbol here next to thin disk mode or anywhere else in the interface here, it has a little help message regarding what thin disk provisioning does. And once again, it doesn't pre-allocate all the space specified for the disk. It's going to save space and only allocate what the VM needs. So with the data store selected and thin disk mode enabled, let's go ahead and click on next to continue. And now it's asking us about the network settings for the vCenter server appliance. So we're going to use IPv4, we're going to use static assignment, and we're going to call this device vCSA.nuggetlab.com. We'll hit tab to go down to the IP address. The IP address that I'd like us to use in this lab for the vCenter server appliance is 192.168.1.111. We'll hit tab to go down to the next field, and the subnet mask is going to be a 24-bit mask, which I'm going to put in dotted decimal as 255.255.255.0, which means the first 3 octets, or the first 3 numbers, if you will, are the network, and that leaves the last octet of 111 as the host address for the vCenter server appliance. We'll hit tab to go down one field, and the default gateway is at 192.168.1.1 on that network. And then we'll scroll down just a little bit more, and it wants to know what DNS server can this vCenter server appliance use to resolve names to IP addresses. And that's going to be our Active Directory server, our Windows computer in the lab that's running DNS and DHCP. And its IP address is 192.168.1. and it is 100. So with those in place, we'll go ahead and click on Next to continue. So we can go ahead and verify our settings, and if they all look correct, we'll go ahead and click on Finish. And then it's going to go ahead and complete stage 1, which is deploying the vCenter server appliance. And this process could take many minutes. So through the magic of editing, we won't have to watch the whole thing, but we'll come back when it's complete. All right, so stage 1, the deployment of the VM is now done. We're going to go ahead and click on Continue. It's asking us about synchronization with NTP servers. For the time being, let's use our Active Directory server as an NTP server. So our Active Directory server, the DNS and DHCP server, is at 192.168.1.100. We'll leave SSH access disabled for the time being. So NTP, the Network Time Protocol, allows a computer to synchronize its time using the NTP protocol, which is UDP port 123, to communicate with an NTP server to get and then synchronize to a reliable clock. So we'll click on Next to continue. Then it's asking for our single sign-on domain for vSphere. So we're going to use the default, which is vSphere.local. And we're going to have a user account named administrator, and this is when we work with the vCenter server, and it wants to know what password should be used for that administrator account. And once again, we're going to use the lab password. So we'll supply the lab password, we'll tab down, and then we'll confirm the same password. And with the administrator password set, we'll tab down once more. And for the site name, let's call it Site1 for our first vCenter site. And what this is effectively saying is that if we're using an embedded vCenter server appliance, where the platform services controller and the vCenter server on the same device, it's effectively saying we can't take another server out here and link that over here to the platform service controller that's already embedded with another server. So the scenario is basically if you want to have external or distributed vCenter server appliances, you need to make sure that the platform services controller is not embedded on the same virtual server appliance with the server. So in our case, it won't apply because we are just using one embedded vCenter server appliance with both those components there on the same appliance. So we'll go ahead and click on Next to continue. It's asking us if we want to join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program. I'm going to go ahead and deselect that for this lab, and we'll click on Next to continue. Here's a summary of what it's about to configure. So let's just quickly make sure it's correct. The IP address for the vCenter server appliance is going to be .111, 24-bit mask, default gateway of .1, DNS server of .100. We're going to synchronize time with the NTP server running at .100. The single sign-on domain is vSphere.local. The site is Site1. The username is administrator, and we're using the lab password for that administrator account. So we'll scroll down a little bit, make sure we didn't miss anything, and we opted out of the customer experience program, and we'll click on Next to continue. Next is saying, hey, you're not going to be able to stop or pause the install until it's done. If you're sure you want to go ahead, click on OK. So we'll click on OK, and it's off to the races. And this part, also in real time, takes many, many minutes. So due to the magic of editing, we won't have to wait the entire time here, but just be prepared. When you do the hands-on lab, you might want to start this process and then maybe do some push-ups or go for a short walk or get some food, because it will take several minutes for this stage 2 appliance setup to complete. And it is now done. It's also indicating that we can connect using the vSphere web client by going to HTTPS, the resolvable name of the vCenter server appliance, followed by vSphere-client. It's also showing port 443, but if you don't include that port, that is the default port for HTTPS. It's also letting us know that there's a getting started page. If we go directly to https:// to the actual name of that appliance, and again, it'll use the default port of 443 if we don't put that in. So, grateful that the install is now done, we'll click on Close. And it's also opened a browser and directed us over to that landing page at vcsa.nuggetlab.com. And the browser on this computer is complaining about the self-signed certificate that the vCenter server appliance is using. So we'll actually launch the vSphere web client in a separate video, but right now I just want to verify a couple things with you. So I'm going to close the windows here. And what I recommend we do is we go back using the VMware host client over to ESXi1 just to verify that the vCenter server appliance as a VM is running on ESXi1. So I've got a shortcut up here in the top left for ESXi1 host. This is going to launch the VMware host client going to ESXi1. So we'll go ahead and double click on that icon. Let's maximize the Explorer window. There's the URL, https 192.168.1.101/UI. So this is the VMware host client just going directly to ESXi1, and we'll click on Continue to this website. From here, we'll log on as root, the root user, using the VMware host client going to ESXi1 directly, and we'll put in the lab password. And with that supplied, we'll click on Login. So on the left, if we click Monitor under the ESXi host, we click Monitor, and with the Performance tab selected and the CPU graph, we can see that this computer, the host, has been working very, very hard during the installation and deployment of the vCenter server appliance. That's what all this CPU right here is all about. And if we wanted to look at the details for the virtual machine itself, over here on the left, we could click on Virtual Machines, And then it shows us the VMware vCenter Server appliance. If we click on that, that also is showing us some graph information over here. We can see here in the hardware configuration for that VM that it has a whole boatload of hard disks that were deployed as part of the vCenter Server appliance. And if we scroll down a little bit, it's got some performance graphs for the last hour. And as we can see, it's been a very, very busy and hungry virtual machine, consuming a lot of resources. And while we're here, before we leave this lab, I want to do one additional thing. I want to make sure that when this ESXi host boots up, I want to make sure that it automatically starts this VM for vCenter Server appliance, because it's going to be the centralized management platform for all of our vSphere in the lab. So if the vCenter appliance doesn't start up automatically when we power on this ESXi host, we'd have to manually come in and do it every single time. So what we can do is let's go ahead and click on Manage right below the host. And on Manage, regarding the ESXi host, on the System tab right here, we have an option for Auto Start. So we'll click on Auto Start, and we'll go ahead and click on Edit Settings because the Auto Start feature is not enabled on this host. So we'll click on Edit Settings right here. We will go ahead and enable it, and let's go ahead and set a default for a start delay of 15 seconds and a stop delay of 15 seconds. And if there's a stop action, we want to go ahead and shut down, which would imply a graceful shutdown of a VM that's currently running on the host. So if we shut down the ESXi host, we want to do a graceful shutdown of the VMs on this host, specifically the vCenter Server appliance. We don't want to crash it. And we'll leave the wait for heartbeat set to a no, and we'll click on Save. Now that's half the battle. We've just set the auto start for the ESXi host. For yes, we need to do the same thing for the actual VM. So we'll click on our VMware vCenter Server over here on the left. And with it highlighted, we'll right-click. And then from the drop-down, we can select Auto Start. And I want to point out something very important here that we're going to be using later as well. And that is this. When we right-click on something and then go to Settings or look at the drop-down, right here, it shows us the focus of what we're working on. So we could have, for example, Host or Monitor highlighted, and then go down and right-click on something else to bring the drop-down menu out for that object. So regardless of what's highlighted over here, it's this title at the top of this drop-down menu that's showing you what the drop-down menu is for. So that's a convenient way to remember what it is you're looking at. So we'll hover over Auto Start for this virtual machine, and then we'll simply click on Enable. And then furthermore, we could go and configure the Auto Start for this specific VM even further. So we can right-click on the VMware vCenter Server Appliance virtual machine, hover down over Auto Start, and now because it's enabled, we can go in and we can configure the details of it. So if we click on Configure regarding Auto Start for the VM, is taking the start and stop delays that we set on the ESXi host, and for the stop action, which we set as shutdown, I'm going to literally select shutdown, and then wait for a heartbeat. The system default was set to no, and so we'll go ahead and accept that here, and we'll click on Save. So what that will do, which is great news for the lab environment, is that when we boot up a subsequent lab and this ESXi host is powered on, it will automatically boot our vCenter Server appliance so that we can use it in subsequent labs, which again is really important if you want to be able to use the vCenter Server appliance. It needs to be running. And in our next nugget, we'll take a look at using the vSphere web client to initially connect to the vCenter Server appliance for centralized administration of our vSphere environment. And now, my friend, it is your turn. I would encourage you to go through the same steps that we did in this nugget so you can get the hands-on practice in deploying and configuring a vCenter Server appliance. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll take a look at the vSphere web client. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.